January 15th, 1919, Boston, Massachusetts. The air is unseasonably warm for a New England winter, hovering at an unusual 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Down in the bustling working-class neighborhood of the North End, life is moving at its usual frantic pace. Children are playing in the streets after lunch, laborers are on their midday breaks, and horses are pulling heavy wagons clattering over the cobblestones. Dominating the skyline of Commercial Street stands a colossal, monstrous structure. It is a giant riveted steel tank, 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide, owned by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. Inside this behemoth sloshes a staggering 2.3 million gallons of raw, heavy, dark brown molasses. To the casual observer, it is just an ugly piece of industrial infrastructure. But to those who work close to it, the tank has been talking. For months, it has been groaning, weeping, and leaking thick brown syrup from its seams. Children from the neighborhood often gather at its base with tin cups to collect the sweet sludge dripping down its metallic flanks. Nobody thinks much of it. It's just molasses. It's sweet, sticky, and harmless. Or so they thought. At precisely 12:40 p.m., a sound like a machine gun tearing through the air echoes across the Boston harbor. It is followed by a dull, earth-shaking roar that witnesses would later describe as a mix between thunder and the horrific screech of a derailed freight train. In a fraction of a second, the giant steel tank doesn't just rupture, it explodes. The rivets holding the steel plates together fly out like bullets, piercing nearby buildings. A 2 million gallon wall of thick, viscous, boiling hot molasses erupts into the streets. It is not a slow, oozing trickle. It is a terrifying 25-foot-high tidal wave traveling at an incredible 35 miles per hour. This is the untold story of the Great Molasses Flood, one of the most bizarre, apocalyptic, and deeply tragic disasters in American history. A story of corporate greed, structural negligence, and a sweet substance turned into a deadly, suffocating monster. To understand how this nightmare came to be, we have to look at why a company would store 2.3 million gallons of molasses in the middle of a densely populated neighborhood. The answer, as with most industrial disasters, boils down to money, war, and politics. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, wasn't making molasses for pancakes or gingerbread. They were in the business of industrial alcohol. By boiling down molasses and fermenting it, they could produce high-purity alcohol. In the years leading up to 1919, this alcohol was a critical ingredient for manufacturing munitions and explosives used in the trenches of World War I. But by late 1918, the war was winding down. A new urgency gripped the executives of USIA: prohibition. The 18th Amendment, which would ban the manufacture and sale of intoxicating liquors in the United States, was on the verge of being ratified. The company was in a frantic race against the clock to distill as much industrial and grain alcohol as possible before the dry laws crippled their operation or changed the legal landscape. In 1915, USIA decided to build a massive storage tank in Boston's North End. The location was chosen for its strategic value, right next to the harbor, so ships from Cuba and the Caribbean could pump raw molasses directly into the tank, and right next to the railway line to transport the distilled alcohol. The construction of the tank was supervised by a man named Arthur Gell. Gell was a financial man, an executive who knew plenty about balancing ledgers, but absolutely nothing about engineering, architecture, or metallurgy. Under pressure to finish the project quickly, Gell bypassed basic safety protocols. He skipped the standard water test, a crucial safety check where a newly built tank is filled with water first to see if it leaks or buckles under pressure. From the day it was completed, the tank was structurally compromised. The steel plates used for the walls were far too thin to support the immense weight of 2.3 million gallons of molasses, which is roughly 40% heavier than water. For 4 years, the tank groaned under the pressure. It leaked so badly that the ground around it was permanently stained brown. Whenever residents complained about the structural integrity, USIA's response wasn't to repair the tank or reinforce the steel. Instead, they painted the entire tank a dark, glossy brown color. Why? So the leaking molasses would blend in with the paint, hiding the structural failure from the public eye.
The days leading up to January 15, 1919, created the perfect physical storm for a disaster. A few days prior, a ship had arrived from the Caribbean, pumping a fresh batch of warm molasses into the tank. This warm liquid was mixed with the older, freezing cold molasses already sitting in the winter air. Inside the tank, a massive thermal reaction began to take place. The sudden change in temperature caused the air and gases trapped inside the thick liquid to expand rapidly. Fermentation was occurring, building up immense internal pressure. On January 15, the outdoor temperature shot up from below freezing to 43 degrees. The external steel expanded, while the internal pressure hit a boiling point. The tank could no longer hold the strain. When the structure gave way, the destruction was instantaneous and total. The physical force of 26,000 tons of rushing molasses was catastrophic. The initial blast wave was so powerful that it literally lifted a house off its foundation and smashed it against a neighboring building. A nearby fire station was crushed like a soda can, trapping the firefighters inside under a mountain of debris and sticky sludge. Even the elevated railway tracks running along Commercial Street were not spared. The kinetic energy of the flying steel plates bent the massive iron girders of the railway line, nearly derailing a passing train. The motorman on the train managed to slam on the brakes just in time, looking out his window to see a churning brown sea consuming the street below.
The scene immediately following the eruption was one of pure horror. The air was thick with the sweet, sickening smell of molasses mixed with the scent of escaping gas, splintered wood, and blood. First responders, including sailors from the USS Nantucket, which was docked nearby, rushed to the scene. But entering the disaster zone was like stepping into quicksand. Sailors and police officers found themselves sinking up to their thighs in thick, freezing slime. Every step required monumental physical effort. Horses, which were the primary mode of transport at the time, were among the most tragic victims. Dozens of them were trapped in the sticky goo, flailing wildly, only to get more entangled. Rescuers had to make the heartbreaking decision to shoot many of them to end their suffering. Human survivors were caught in a desperate battle for breath. Anthony DeStasio, a young boy walking home from school, was picked up by the wave and carried down the street as if he were surfing on a nightmare. He recalled tumbling over and over inside the dark, sweet mass, suffocating until he managed to grab onto a floating piece of debris. Rescuers worked frantically through the afternoon and into the night. They used axes, shovels, and bare hands to dig through collapsed buildings that were completely filled with molasses. When they found survivors, they had to scrape the thick crust away from their faces just so they could breathe. The cold evening air made things significantly worse. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped, and the molasses began to solidify into a hard, taffy-like substance. It acted like a literal tomb for those trapped beneath the surface. In total, 21 people lost their lives that day, and over 150 were severely injured. The victims ranged from young children to elderly residents and stable hands. Many did not die from physical trauma, but from asphyxiation. They had simply drowned in sugar. If the disaster itself was unprecedented, the cleanup was an administrative nightmare. You cannot simply wash away millions of gallons of hardened molasses with regular fire hoses. The fresh water caused the molasses to foam up and spread further. engineers quickly realized they needed a different solution: salt water. Fireboats in the Boston harbor pumped millions of gallons of salt water onto the streets, cutting through the sticky residue and flushing it into the ocean. It took weeks of continuous work by hundreds of laborers, soldiers, and volunteers to clear the bulk of the mess from the North End. But the disaster didn't stay contained to the neighborhood. The people cleaning the streets tracked the molasses on their boots into the subways, onto streetcars, and into homes all over the city of Boston. For months, everything in the city, from telephone receivers to theater seats, was sticky to the touch. The Boston harbor turned a murky brown color and remained that way until summer. As the physical cleanup concluded, a massive legal battle began. The residents of the North End, primarily Italian and Irish immigrants, banded together to sue the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. It became one of the first major class action lawsuits in Massachusetts history. USIA's defense strategy was both brazen and cowardly. They claimed they were completely innocent. Instead of admitting that their tank was poorly built, they blamed the disaster on anarchists and terrorists.
In 1919, America was experiencing the Red Scare. Bombings by political extremists were a real fear across the country. USIA argued that an anti-war or anti-corporate anarchist had dropped a pipe bomb into the tank, causing it to explode. They even pointed out that a nearby phone booth had received a threatening call weeks prior. The state appointed a special auditor named Hugh W. Ogden to oversee the massive trial, which dragged on for 5 grueling years. Over 1,000 witnesses testified, and thousands of pages of expert engineering data were collected. In the end, Ogden saw right through the company's corporate smokescreen. The structural evidence was overwhelming. Engineers proved that the tank's steel was half as thick as it should have been, and the rivets were under-engineered for the stress they were meant to hold. Furthermore, Arthur Gell's admission that he never tested the tank with water sealed the company's fate. In 1925, the court ruled against USIA, ordering them to pay $300,000 in damages, equivalent to millions of dollars today. It was a landmark victory for public safety and corporate accountability. The legal precedent set by this case paved the way for stricter building codes, mandatory engineering certifications, and enhanced public safety regulations across the United States. Today, if you visit the north end of Boston, you won't see any towering steel tanks. The site of the disaster has been transformed into a beautiful public park, complete with a recreational baseball field and a bocce court. But if you walk near the entrance of the park, you will find a small, modest bronze plaque embedded in a brick wall. It serves as a quiet reminder of the afternoon when a 25-foot wave of industrial waste altered the landscape of this community forever. The Great Molasses Flood remains a bizarre footnote in the history books, often overshadowed by the horrors of World War I and the impending chaos of the Prohibition era. Yet it stands as a stark cautionary tale about what happens when corporate greed, haste, and a lack of regulation override basic human safety. For decades after the disaster, longtime residents of the North End swore that on hot, humid summer days, when the sun beats down heavily on the pavement, you can still smell it. A faint, sweet, unmistakable scent of molasses rising from the historic soil of Boston. A haunting reminder of the day a town was destroyed by sugar.